Story 1. King Canute went down to the beach and commanded the tide to stop. Not a fool who thought he had power over the sea, but a pragmatic ruler who wanted to show his sycophantic counselors that he was merely human and not divine. Story 2. Lindy Chamberlain, the dingo lady. Her child went missing, and when she reported it, she was immediately arrested for murder. Investigators talked with indigenous people who said, "Oh yes, dingoes could definitely run off with a child." And they ignored that. They only half-heartedly searched the area where the child went missing. The child's jacket was found and remains later, but Lindy had already spent time in jail, and public opinion had already moved to where the only thing known about the case was the "a dingo ate my baby" jokes. Story 3. Some of the more infamous Roman emperors were probably actually pretty decent. The contemporary historians we depend on for our sources came from the political elite, so the emperors who did not treat the upper class with kid gloves tend to come off worse in the historical record. Not to say Caligula or Commodus were good people or good emperors. They certainly were not, but others like Domitian really just seem like competent rulers whose reforms challenged elite power and privilege. Story 4. Georges Eugene Haussmann was known for transforming the historic city of Paris, but historic Paris was a rickety fire hazard past its best-by date. He built more than he destroyed, and he modernized the infrastructure so Paris is the functional modern city that it is today. Story 5. King John, also known as John Lackland, was dealt a difficult hand since Richard, despite being popular, was a wildly awful king and bankrupted the country. Contrary to Robin Hood myths, he taxed the nobles much more than he did the peasants to pay Richard's expenses, which is why history wrote so negatively of him after his reign. He wasn't a great king, but he was pretty decent despite his challenging starting position. Story 6. She was kidnapped and forced into slavery as a preteen, then learned the languages of her different traffickers and was eventually given to Hernán Cortés as a peace offering from her owners, who used her for her ability to speak different languages of the tribes and also for exploitation by her captors. On top of that, people still refused to acknowledge that the Aztec Empire was viscerally hated by the surrounding tribes who had been conquered, murdered, and sacrificed by the Aztecs. So basically, a young girl who was kidnapped and enslaved was forced to translate for her owners, which helped them conquer the hated empire that had conquered her people. She is shamed centuries later for being a traitor. That would be like calling 14-year-old Sally Hemings a traitor for her relationship with Thomas Jefferson. Story 7. Aristophanes. This may be the nerd choice, but he called out the philosophers and the sophists in a comedic fashion, showing that Strepsiades and Socrates were both similar despite their differing views. Plato accuses him of causing Socrates' death, but if one man's satire is enough to get another man killed, look out for Jon Stewart. Story 8. Ulysses S. Grant, a military genius, saved the Union when all the other generals failed. He won both major theaters of the war and rolled back guerrilla wars in the South that arose during the Johnson administration. He reestablished America internationally. Of course, the domestic front failed when the Democrats returned to power. Everyone loved talking about Lee and makes fun of Grant, but history is very different. Story 9. Catherine de' Medici was often blamed for things like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre when she was innocent of much of it. Her biggest mistake was thinking that two extremely passionate, polarized groups could be brought together for a reasonable discussion about religion. She never intended a bloodbath. Story 10. Roman Emperor Gallienus was hated by so many people, and the sources we have, like Historia Augusta, since he lost 2/3 of the empire, the so-called Gallic Empire and Palmyra. But he tried his best and did an incredible job. The crisis of the 3rd century was just that horrible. And the empire would not have lasted much longer without his changes to the military. Story 11. I feel Thomas Edison's reputation was once too positive with baby boomers, but there has been a massive overcorrection in the last 10 years, and we're now pretending he contributed nothing. Story 12. Cardinal Richelieu. Dumas kind of made him a villain for many generations of young readers, while in fact he was a decent statesman and probably had a net positive effect on France. Story 13. Chamberlain. Appeasement tempted Hitler to start the war too soon. If he had waited 5 years, Germany would have been much better armed and possibly had the atomic bomb. Herbert Hoover. While he made the Depression worse, he was following the best advice available at the time. It is significant that Franklin D. Roosevelt, too, initially tried to balance the budget. Story 14. Coach Dan Devine of the Green Bay Packers in Rudy. In the movie, he doesn't want Rudy to play, but in real life, it was his call to put Rudy in the game. Story 15. King George III, the farmer, is naturally the big bad guy of any United States Independence War story since he was the one Americans fought their independence war against. But he is called the farmer for one good reason. He was one of the best kings England ever had, reigned for 60 years, and introduced considerable reforms and infrastructure projects. Those reforms and projects are the reason why he tried to tax the American settlers that weren't represented in Parliament, which caused the independence movement. Story 16. Simon Girty is often depicted as a traitor in American history, but there is a strong case to be made that he was, in fact, a person of principle and compassion, especially when considering the complex circumstances of the American frontier during the 18th century. Girty's early life played a significant role in shaping his views. He was captured by the Seneca and adopted into their society, a common practice among Native American tribes that often sought to replace lost family members. This experience gave him deep insight into Native American culture, something many European settlers lacked or misunderstood. Unlike others who saw Native Americans as mere obstacles to expansion, Girty developed empathy for their way of life and came to view them as equals rather than enemies. During the American Revolution and the later conflicts on the frontier, Girty chose to side with the British and Native American forces. This decision is often portrayed as treacherous, but Girty's reasoning was based on his belief that the American colonists' ambitions were ultimately more harmful to the indigenous peoples. He witnessed firsthand the colonists' disregard for treaties and their insatiable hunger for land, which led to the displacement and suffering of Native American tribes. Girty likely saw the British, who had a more cautious approach to westward expansion and often negotiated with native groups, as a lesser evil. Furthermore, Girty acted as an intermediary and translator between Native American tribes and European forces, often using his position to advocate for mercy and restraint. He reportedly intervened in several instances to prevent brutal acts of violence, sometimes risking his own life to save captives from being tortured or executed by native warriors. This paints a picture of someone who, despite the chaotic and brutal nature of the frontier, tried to maintain a sense of humanity and moral responsibility. In many ways, Simon Girty's legacy suffers because he stood against the tide of American expansionism, which later historians, influenced by a narrative of manifest destiny, portrayed in a negative light. But when judged by his actions and motivations, Girty was a man who sought to protect those he had come to know and care for, even if that meant going against his own people. Story 17. Almost every villain in Mexico's history. The party with power needed a villain to justify their existence, and then as that person was an enemy of another person, that other person is considered good, but they have other enemies, so they are considered bad too, and so on. Story 18. Napoleon Bonaparte. I don't get why he is seen differently from any other monarch-type ruler. He also introduced a lot of good things like public education. Story 19. William Dodd, the United States ambassador to Nazi Germany. I read the book In the Garden of Beasts by Eric Larson based on a recommendation from Reddit, and it read like a real-life spy adventure. A wonderfully unique perspective of World War II. Story 20. Joel Alamara. He was a college student's boyfriend who got blamed for her murder because he had an LL.B knife and her picture was cut up, but the killer struck again while he was locked up. They never found the guy, but he got the nickname Spring-Heel Jack. He would only strike in New England during an unusual warm spell in the middle of winter, around 1975 or so. Story 21. Macbeth. He killed Duncan in battle, not in his sleep, and by all accounts, he was a decent ruler of Scotland. Shakespeare was just supporting James I and the Stuart dynasty with the Scottish play. Story 22. Fritz Haber. Sure, he made a huge contribution to the development of chemical weapons in World War I, as well as inventing a precursor to the world's most infamous pesticide, but we wouldn't have modern-day agriculture without him. Story 23. I see this all the time, and my go-to answer is J. Bruce Ismay. His name has gone down in history as a byword for coward, even though he was a hero on the night of the Titanic sinking, helping passengers up to lifeboats, loading the boats, and assisting with the evacuation. He only got into a lifeboat when there was no one left in his section. But because he had made an enemy of William Randolph Hearst a few years before, Hearst used the yellow press he owned to paint Ismay as a coward. Then, when a first-class passenger came forward during the Senate inquiry claiming she had seen Ismay pressuring Captain Smith to go faster, that was it. They then portrayed him as the villain of the Titanic disaster. When Walter Lord repeated the allegations in A Night to Remember, the reignited interest in the Titanic also portrayed him as the coward of the night. Even James Cameron did it, admitting it was what the audience expected. Story 24. Marie Antoinette is often blamed for the French Revolution and seen as a symbol of excess, but she actually supported different charitable causes and was a victim of her time and the situation she was in. Story 25. Napoleon has got a bad reputation from historians, largely because the victors write the history. Now, Napoleon wasn't a saint by any means, not by a long shot. But a lot of his wars were not wars of choice on his part. They were more or less the logical consequences of the policies pursued by his opponents. Moreover, he initiated a lot of reorganization and legislation that has withstood the test of time. The term Code Napoleon means something in most European countries as well as in their former colonies. People have hung on to that, built on it, and moved it forward, retaining its basic structure because of its quality. The spread of the metric system across the world started with Napoleon's reforms of France's medieval, crazy system of weights and measures. In short, this is not a pitch to depict Napoleon as some sort of saint or hero, but he has left a legacy from which a lot of people benefit today. Story 26. Cardinal Richelieu is portrayed as a villain in The Three Musketeers, but he actually laid the groundwork for France's rise as a major European power by weakening the nobility and consolidating the royal power. Story 27. Tons of prosecutors. Many innocence fraud campaigns and true crime documentaries have painted prosecutors as these evil people trying to lock everyone up with no evidence. This is very rarely the case. Story 28. Liebeck in Liebeck v. McDonald's. The hot coffee case. She literally just wanted medical treatment for the burns McDonald's caused. She ended up winning and apparently settling for less money. Story 29. It is not history, just fiction, although millions still believe in this, so I guess it qualifies. Satan, devil, Lucifer, whatever name, the dude is just a cast-out angel who once spoke out to his sadistic dad. As to hell and eternal damnation, the man is just doing his job, which he most likely does not enjoy like most of us. Story 30. Mother Teresa. Practically all the allegations against her come from precisely one person, and her biggest critic, Christopher Hitchens, misconstrued or withheld evidence that would not have supported his narrative that she was a terrible, evil person. There is a bad history thread about it for the interested. Edit. Samuel Wilberforce, the Anglican Oxford bishop who opposed Darwin's ideas, was actually a well-regarded scientific mind in his time. His objections to Darwin's theories were grounded in orthodox science of the time, to the point Darwin actually listened, modified his theories, and called Wilberforce a genius. But that tends to get overlooked in favor of a simple science versus religion argument. Story 31. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say they're good. But Che Guevara and Fidel Castro are made out to be these power-hungry terrorists when Fidel used to be a lawyer who represented the poor pro bono, and Guevara was a doctor. Story 32. Jonah Jameson. He was a publisher who crusaded for the downtrodden and held the powerful to answer for their wrongs. He never revealed his sources. Also, he went after a piece of trash vigilante who kept destroying the city and putting innocents at risk. Story 33. I am going to argue Napoleon I. He gets a lot of bad press due to propaganda from the winners, who in most cases were the aggressors, but his administrative reforms improved the lives of millions of Europeans. Being annexed or occupied by him generally gave one more freedom and more rights than one had previously. Story 34. My suspicion is that our popular understanding of Rasputin as some sinister sex-crazed occultist is just Bolshevik propaganda to help justify their vicious persecution of clerics and to scandalize the memory of the murdered Romanovs. Story 35. Julius Caesar, for sure. Guy cares for the people and genuinely does everything in his efforts to help them while taking away power from those at the top. Yet, people only think he is some ruthless war machine. Story 36. I heard the Persian ruler who was villainized in the movie 300 was actually a pro-democracy leader who was calm, and the Spartans, who were the warriors, were actually a fascist military-run society and also allegedly harmed children because it was a way of growing up or something. Story 37. Niccolò Machiavelli, associated with cunning and ruthless political strategies due to his book, The Prince, actually advocated for a realistic understanding of power. Story 38. I always thought Marie Antoinette got a bad reputation. Many of the claims and scandals against her were based on gossip and straight-up lies that painted her as callous, greedy, and lecherous, such as the cake comment, the affair of the diamond necklace, or her affairs, which did have some truth to them. In reality, there is evidence suggesting she was, in fact, a kind and compassionate person since childhood, and that her only real crime was being born into a society that encouraged her to live in excess, which even she thought was too much at times. It's not like there weren't numerous other nobles doing the same thing as her, but you don't know any of them by name. Frankly, I think she was and is a victim of extreme and misplaced misogyny.